just been connected to the largest spiritual network on the planet, The Jeffrey Daugherty Show.
Jeffrey Daugherty.
Sink or swim, deep end information, parabiblical research, spiritual technologies, personal empowerment. Be your own guru. Guide your own spirit. Master your own ascension. And now, showing you how, here's Jeffrey Daugherty.
Hello, folks. Jeffrey Daugherty here. I am the Christian whistleblower. Glad to be back with you and talking about Apostle Paul Antichrist, the new 410-page book, 50 more pages, fully annotated and footnoted. And we've talked about Nero. We've talked about Alexander the Great. We've talked a little bit about the beginnings of the relationship between Paul and Jesus. We've talked about the world of Jerusalem that those men all stepped into. And all of these things are vital to understand exactly what went on and exactly what was going on and to get a full picture of what we're talking about. So you understand Nero, and we have to understand there's other players on the scene, such as Herod, who was, of course, the king. And then there was Caiaphas, who was the high priest. And those two really did not get along with one another at all. And yet, they were facing, as we will see, and as I've shown in this book, a situation that required the two of them to work together. And the big problem with Herod is that he was the king of the Jews, but to the Jews, he wasn't even a Jew at all. Herod's ancestry did wind back like a muddy river to the Edomites, which were converts to Judaism long time ago in the past. And that was a damning fact to the nationalistic Jews. And adding further silt, if you will, to his hereditary waters was the strong Hellenist influence that ran through the Edomites. And of course, we've shown that that's an influence that can be traced right back to the feet of Alexander the Great himself. And I can understand that Herod could be frustrated by that. I mean, if it wasn't for Alexander the Great sparing Jerusalem, well, there wouldn't be a Jerusalem anymore. There wouldn't be Jews anymore, because he had in mind to completely, utterly destroy it. And yet, in his mind, he's being blamed for his heritage, which really, if you look at it, had kept the nation free. Now, of course, Herod did owe his throne to the Herodian dynasty, and that had really been perpetuated by his father's political sorcery. He had been known as Herod the Great, and we all know about him. And he's a man that, folks, somehow Herod the Great managed to curry a measure of favor with the Maccabees, who the Jews considered to be the rightful heirs to the throne, while at the same time maintaining an alliance with the Gentile overlords. Herod the Great was kind of the first Paul, if you look at it in that way. He was able to walk the line of religion and politics. I guess they didn't call him Herod the Great for nothing. And the Herodian dynasty lived on, but people understood from whence it had come. But they now had a common problem. John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth. It was very important to them both to keep their influence to a minimum, because it simply wouldn't do for that influence to spread all the way to Rome. They knew that if Rome caught wind of a preacher named John who was talking about things like the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven, talking about God being king, that of course meant Rome couldn't be. And if Rome felt like they weren't going to be able to handle the situation, well, Rome had a way of moving in and moving on, if you know what I mean. And Caiaphas was looking at a religious problem, because as Jesus' influence grew, Caiaphas' influence waned, and the people, even though they remained Jews, tended to spend a lot more time and money on Jesus and in his movement than they did on the regular ministrations of the temple. I mean, Jesus was causing ripples in the temple's religious power and in their financial base. A growing number of Jews embracing the message of Jesus. And as they did, they became less a part of the Orthodox community. And Jesus was teaching something a lot more scary. He was beginning to teach that men could get to God without an intermediary. And if he was indeed teaching that we could get to God without priests, well, that was something that the high priest really was upset about. So, as much as they disliked one another, as much as they did not want to work with each other, it seemed that their combined resources would make handling the problem much more expedient. And Herod just happened to have somebody within his household, within his family, that might be the perfect man for the job. That was Saul of Tarsus. That's right, folks. Saul was an Edomite. Saul was of the Herodian lineage. Paul was from the Herodian dynasty, and he was related to King Herod. And that was one of the things that allowed him to come into the place where he was in order to put together this amalgamation of the political, the social, and the religious. It really was very, very interesting. So Caiaphas, the high priest, Herod the king, and then, of course, you had Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect. Pardon me there, I had to grab a little drink. And Pontius Pilate had to have been approached by Caiaphas and Herod to bring him into their situation. And these guys were always complaining to Pilate. And Pilate really would listen, but Pilate, I have to believe, viewed the Jesus movement as much more of a nuisance than a threat. And in spite of his many years in the legions of Rome, he was a guy that wasn't really looking to shed blood unnecessarily, because that meant that it was going to cause problems for him back in Rome. And his only real issue with the Jews was that, with Jesus rather, was that he made the Jews nervous. And even in the best of times, Pilate thought the Jews were a bunch of complainers. And when they were nervous or agitated, they complained even more. And Jesus was causing their complaining to rise to levels of real irritation to Pilate. And his biggest worry was very similar to Caiaphas and Herod. His biggest worry was that the complaints of the Jews would somehow reach the ear of Caesar, and Rome would begin to think that he couldn't handle the job anymore. And that worry wasn't really that far-fetched. The Jews were industrious merchants and traders who traveled far and wide. Some of them even did business in Rome. And it wasn't a stretch for Pilate to think that one of them could somehow have the ear of someone that had the ear of the emperor. And to think about the sheer number of hungry pups back in Rome just waiting for a reason to lobby their own promotion, well, it can make even an old centurion shiver, and one never knows how fair they'll be treated when Rome decides to put you out to pasture. So Pilate, on one hand, he thought it was ridiculous because Jesus, was not his problem. But on the other hand, John the Baptist was. John the Baptist was a real problem. And in Pilate's mind, he could bring real revolt. So Herod and Caiaphas basically offered Pilate a deal. They said, hey, look, we need Jesus gone. You need John the Baptist gone. Let's work together. Well, the only problem with that was that Pilate's wife had begun listening to Jesus, and Pilate knew it. And how in the world was Pilate going to work on getting rid of Jesus, a man that his wife was listening to? I mean, the options were not good for him. His wife would be devastated, but he really didn't have much of a choice. She'd be upset, or she could be a widow, or even worse, because the families of shamed officials often faced tragic ends. So Pilate was between the proverbial rock and a hard place. But in the end, the Jews, he knew, would figure a way to kill Jesus with or without his help. It was bound to happen. Maybe he could at least try and shape it to his own ends, perhaps get something out of it in return. And I think he began to think, you know what, if they get my acquiescence on Jesus, if they take care of John the Baptist first. The Baptist for the Galilean, those were his terms. It made perfect sense to him, although he doubted that his wife would quite see it that way. So you had this political intrigue that was really religious in nature, and it was driven by the rhetoric and the preaching of John the Baptist, really, because Jesus had yet to actually walk onto the scene. And think about this. I mean, 400 years of silence, and then all of a sudden here's John the Baptist out preaching repentance. And, you know, there's a story in the Bible where the priests finally said, you know, Caiaphas said, look, we got to see what's going on with this guy. So they walked out to the Jordan, you know, made the dusty trek to see what was going on, and they had to be very, very shocked because, I mean, imagine they walk out to the Jordan River, and there, lined on both sides of that river for at least 100 yards in both directions, was this mass of humanity. I mean, they only in their wildest dreams had they ever feared such crowds could be present. I mean, these were Passover day crowds. And they were shocked. And the people were shocked to see the priest come. You know, people are thinking, are the priests going to receive the message? Do they think John is right? And so the priests walk up to John the Baptist. And John the Baptist stops his preaching. This is all in the Bible. The priests look at him. They say, tell us plainly, are you the Messiah? You know, John's probably pretty ticked that they interrupted his sermon. But he tries to control himself. He says, no, I'm not the Messiah. I've been telling you for months I'm not the Messiah. I'm the guy that's come to prepare the way for the Messiah. Then they ask him, are you Elijah? You know, hearkening back to the last message some 400 years ago by Malachi, and, you know, John says, hey, my name is John. And they were maybe perhaps less worried because now they don't think that he's trying to say he's the Messiah. So maybe they're feeling just a little bit better. And then one of them says, well, then who are you? And John probably was about at his wit's end. He was probably just about as upset as he could be. And his control, well, it cracked, and John let him have it. Called him a generation of vipers. Told him to flee from the wrath that was coming. Said to him, you think you're Abraham's children? Well, that won't save you. Tell the people that sent you here that the axe is about to be laid to the root of the tree, and all the branches that have not borne good fruit will be chopped down and thrown into the fire. The priest didn't require an interpretation. They knew Israel was the tree. They knew, pretty sure they knew who the branches were. And they looked at one another. They were having a really bad day. And as they got ready to leave, John hit him with this parting shot. One's coming after me. He'll have his fan in his hand, and he will purge the land, burn up the chaff with an unquenchable fire. I've got to believe that in spite of the heat, a chill ran up the spine of those priests because they knew that things were about to get interesting. And they had to have been thinking, wow, silence was golden. So this is the backstory of what was going on in the times of Jesus. John the Baptist, the apostles, and Paul, who called himself an apostle. This gives you the understanding of what happened, which can allow you to understand what is about to happen as we move forward. If you want to write me, contact me. Cliff's about to tell you how to do it. Until tomorrow, I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian whistleblower, wishing you peace and light.
Stay connected with the largest spiritual network on the planet, www.imnck.com. On Facebook, Jeffrey Daugherty and Jeffrey Daugherty Show. And on Twitter at NCKabbalah. Visit imnck.com today and learn how to create yourself and live the life you'll love.